HighBridge Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mrs. Harris Goes to Parliament by Paul Gallico, read by Juliet Stevenson.
Anyone who insists upon trying to identify characters in this book with living persons simply isn't playing the game. This is wholly a work of fantasy and fiction, and I trust will be accepted as such. Paul Gallico. Chapter 1. John Bayswater reached over and switched off the television set, and all three, Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Butterfield, and the prim, handsome-looking, elderly chauffeur, remained sitting for a few moments more in the semi-darkness, watching the dying spot of light at the centre of the now blank screen. For the past 45 minutes, its surface had been occupied by a pseudo-intellectual programme entitled What Do You Think? A panel consisting of a famous author, a lawyer, and a member of Parliament had been giving their opinions on questions of the day submitted by the audience, a caucus in which the Honourable Ronald Puckle, MP, had rather smothered the others, hogging the screen on every possible occasion.
"Phew!" said Mrs. Harris. "Wasn't he a one?"
"I thought he delivered himself of some extremely sage remarks," said Mr. Bayswater, "particularly when he recommended lowering the tax on motor cars. It's quite shocking what we pay on the rolls. As for what the poor people do—"
"Gone," said Mrs. Harris. "He had a real brain tub. No blanks. Prizes for everyone. I know he's kind."
"I'll put the kettle on and make the sandwiches,"
said Mrs. Butterfield, raising her portly form from the deep settee, which was hers by right due to her weight and bulk. The occasion was the regular Thursday night tea and telly session that took place in the living-room of Ada Harris's house, No. 5, Willis Gardens, Battersea, London. From 8 sharp to 11, Mrs. Harris, the adventurous London char, Violet Butterfield, her best friend, and Mr. John Bayswater, chauffeur to the rich, whose status somewhat defied classification, but whom Ada might have listed modestly as a gentleman friend, watched television programmes. Promptly at 11 they had tea, sandwiches, and little cakes covered with icing in violent colours, and conducted a small forum of their own on the subjects they had seen. At 11:45, by the mantel clock, the face of which was supported by 2 cupids, Bayswater would arise, clear his throat, send his starched cuffs back into the sleeves of his smartly cut jacket, and say,
"Well, ladies, I'm indebted to you for a most pleasant evening,"
and take his departure. The three had met on a liner going to America, where Mrs. Harris and Mrs. Butterfield had been employed by a film magnate and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Schreiber, and Bayswater was accompanying the Marquis de Chassagne, French ambassador to the United States, and his Rolls-Royce. Their lives had become briefly entangled over the matter of a small boy, who Mrs. Harris, via the Marquis, had introduced illegally into America in an effort to find his long-lost father. However, all were London-born and bred, and found they were not happy too far from the sound of the Bow bells. Now they were back again in their familiar haunts, with Mrs. Harris, char, and Mrs. Butterfield, part-time cook, having collected clients for whom they did on an hourly basis. Mrs. Harris and Bayswater had something further in common, in that they were now working for the same man, Sir Wilmot Corison, property tycoon and influential behind-the-scenes politician of the Centre Party. Bayswater was chauffeur to Sir Wilmot's new Golden Cloud Rolls-Royce, while Mrs. Harris dropped in for an hour or so each morning at the small mews house behind Eaton Square, which Sir Wilmot maintained as a pied-à-terre in London when it was necessary for him to remain late at the office, and where he often slept when he did not feel like returning to his country home in Buckinghamshire. Twice a week, it might be noted, Mrs. Harris also numbered John Bayswater amongst her clients, for she would pop in to tidy up the little flat he owned in that section of London which had the same name as his, Bayswater. But there was no charge for this, since Mrs. Harris had never forgotten Bayswater's kindness and help during her difficulties in America. But for the rest, the friendship with Bayswater had remained static. The chauffeur was a confirmed bachelor, whose only real loves, apparently, were the various Rolls-Royce cars he had driven, and over which he fussed internally and externally, groomed and polished until everything in their interiors was reduced to an inaudible whisper, while their exteriors glittered and shone immaculately. This night the debate raged around the personality and opinions of the Honourable Ronald Puckle, Conservative Member of Parliament for Marley Vale.
"It's the likes of him as what's wrong with the government,"
Mrs. Harris announced, casting a resentful look at the television screen, as though the somewhat flabby image of the Honourable Member was still etched upon it.
"A windbag, and not much of a bag at that."
"Indeed,"
said Mr. Bayswater.
"Well now, he struck me as very sound on a number of subjects."
"Sound?"
echoed Mrs. Harris. Then she mimicked the voice of the interlocutor.
"And how do you feel about the future of Britain, sir?"
And followed with the reply of the worthy parliamentarian.
"Oh, very good, excellent, splendid." And then he goes on for 10 minutes. And what does he say? What goes up must come down. What's too lean wants a bit of fat. What's too fat wants to lose some weight. Cut off the tops of the hills to fill up the valleys, and keep running in one place as fast as you can. Coo! He was as false as his teeth. Couldn't you see his eyes shifting about every time they asked him a question? "Was something wrong with his teeth?"
queried Mrs. Butterfield, who always managed to lag somewhat behind the arguments.
"I thought they was very handsome."
"Too handsome," snapped Mrs. Harris. "Dentures. If I was him, I'd stay away from those television cameras. They look right through you."
Mr. Bayswater protested, slightly starchily.
"I suppose you, being Labour, would naturally feel—"
Mrs. Harris interrupted him with a snort.
"Oh, me? Labour? Not on your life. If anything, they're worse. I've heard and seen and had me fill of them. What they're going to do for the working man. They're ignorant as well as hypocrites. I've got my own party. Live and let live, I calls it. Me and Vi, here, if we were in Parliament, we'd tell 'em a thing or two, wouldn't we, Vi?"
Mrs. Butterfield's small mouth formed into a tiny O of alarm in the large round moon of her face as she said,
"Oh, I wouldn't dare."
"Well, I would,"
stated Mrs. Harris with such vehemence that the pink silk fringe on the lampshade stirred.
"I'd tell the lot of them what's wrong with the government and how the country should be run."
Mr. Bayswater smiled a friendly and tolerant smile, for he was really very fond of Mrs. Harris, found her company most pleasant, and hugely enjoyed their tea and telly evenings.
"I'll wager you would, Ada," he said, "and maybe you'd even do them some good."
Here the mantel clock went into its imitation of Big Ben, chiming the 3/4 hour. Mr. Bayswater rose, adjusted his jacket, shot his cuffs, said,
"Well, ladies, I'm indebted to you for a most pleasant evening,"
and took his departure, as did Mrs. Butterfield after the dishes had been done. Mrs. Harris went to bed, but she did not sleep for a long time, for she kept thinking of the words of Mr. Bayswater, whose judgment and intellect she greatly respected.
"I'll wager you would, Ada, and maybe you'd even do them some good."
And the more she thought, the more apt her slogan of live and let live appeared to her, and in the manner of those who dream, she began to embellish it as she thought of all the injustices that abounded not only in her life, but in the lives of everyone, injustices which only needed some common sense and goodwill to correct. How was it that such insincere creatures as the Honourable Ronald Puckle could get themselves elected into the Parliament of England? Ada Harris did not know quite how the Parliament operated, and certainly nothing about politics, beyond her feeling that all politicians were worth not very much. She had never been inside the House, and so she had to imagine the delectable scene where someone in some kind of gorgeous costume with knee breeches and carrying a mace or crozier tapped for order and cried, "Pray silence, ladies and gentlemen and right honourable members. We will now hear from Mrs. Ada Harris on the subject, What's Wrong with Britain?" While organising the various details of her speech, Ada Harris finally fell asleep. Chapter 2. The following morning, Mrs. Harris arose betimes to begin, as did so many thousands of her fellow charwomen, their rounds of homes and offices that would leave them sparkling until their owners or inhabitants pigged them up again. She was still filled with echoes of last night's discussion and her subsequent fantasies. These had left her with a curious sensation of unfulfilment, the way she often felt when she remembered something she had meant to do and had not done. It had been rather a beautiful dream. The later life of Ada Harris had somehow managed to be filled with beautiful dreams, some of which, astonishingly, she had been able to realise. By the time, however, she had scrubbed the offices of the Electro Appliance Company in Sloane Square, called in upon one of her oldest clients, Lady Dant, whose wardrobe once started Mrs. Harris off to Paris in quest of all things, a Dior dress for her very own, cleaned up the surprising clutter that Major Tiverton succeeded in leaving every morning, considering that he was a bachelor, and finally messed about in the laboratory of Alexander Hero, the echoes had begun to fade. They were revived by the unusual circumstances which developed as she fished the keys for number 88 Eton Mews North out of her Rexine carryall and let herself into the cottage of Sir Wilmot Corrison. For a hoarse voice shouted down from the upstairs bedroom.
"Hello! Is that you, Mrs. Harris? Don't be alarmed. I'm here in bed."
A most unusual circumstance indeed, and a most unusual time. For when he stayed in town, Sir Wilmot was always at his office by 9 in the morning, and here it was just past 11.
"You're not ill, are you?"
cried Mrs. Harris.
"Just a bit of a throat,"
croaked Sir Wilmot from above.
"I'll be quite all right."
Mrs. Harris deposited her bag, shouting,
"You just stay nice and quiet while I put the kettle on for a cup of tea, and I'll be right up to look after you."
A cup of tea was Mrs. Harris's panacea for all illness, or at least the proper start of any cure. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove to boil, donned her overall and dust cap, marched upstairs and into the bedroom of Sir Wilmot, saying, "Now then." While it was obvious that Sir Wilmot's condition was not grave, it was also plain that he was not entirely himself. He had spent an uncomfortable night sweating, for his thinning hair was rumpled, his pyjamas were rumpled, the bedclothes were rumpled, there was an assortment of pastils and medicines on his night-table, and an open briefcase on his bed with papers scattered on the blankets, as well as fallen to the floor. The ashtray full of cigarette stubs also indicated that he'd been busy during the night counteracting whatever palliatives he'd been taking with cigarette smoke and nicotine.
"Hello, hello, hello,"
said Mrs. Harris, and went on,
"Naughty boy. What have you been up to, getting yourself sick?"
"Just a relaxed throat,"
croaked Sir Wilmot.
"I didn't feel much like going to the office. I've sent Bayswater out to the country to fetch my wife. I shall be quite all right."
"You will, after I've done making you comfortable,"
Mrs. Harris asserted.
Now then, for a beginning, we'll have fresh linen and clean pyjamas.
She was already at his chest of drawers, reaching him the latter articles.
Just you pop into the bathroom and tidy up while I make the bed and clear away a bit. I'll tell you when you can come out.
In truth, Sir Wilmot was glad to see her, for it would be several hours more before his wife could be expected to arrive. He was a large, florid, well-fed man, whose features might have been pleasant and attractive, except that there was a slightly unfinished look about them. Everything was that shade too small for the rest of his face, the pointed nose, the somewhat pursy mouth, eyes a fraction too close together, and little ears, as though insufficient material had been used. But he was known as a kind enough man, particularly to those who worked satisfactorily for him, as well as a shrewd, ruthless operator and a wheel and a power behind the centre party, which was trying to make an impression in the forthcoming general election. Now he trotted off obediently to the bathroom, clutching his clean pyjamas, looking somewhat like an overgrown baby. Once the door closed, Mrs. Harris attacked the room with both fury and efficiency. 20 minutes later, Sir Wilmot lay comfortably and blissfully ensconced between clean sheets, the pillows punched up to support his back, a tray with tea, hot buttered toast, marmalade, and orange juice resting on his lap, ashtrays emptied, curtains drawn, the room filled with fresh air. He was feeling a great deal better, a good gargle and wash-up having relieved the congestion in his throat.
"Mrs. Harris, you're an angel," he said.
Do you think so? Well, it's very nice of you to say so. I like looking after people. Now, not any more cigarettes this morning, and just you have your breakfast while I clear up downstairs. Then I'll come back again and see how you're getting on, and maybe have a bit of a chat.
There was nothing to alarm Sir Wilmot in this statement, for he was still euphoric and filled with gratitude, to the point where he had forgotten what every politician knows, namely that nothing, but absolutely nothing, is for free in life, and that for every service rendered there is a little bill to pay. For all the while downstairs that Mrs. Harris was hoovering the carpet, dusting the paintings and ornaments, and giving the mellow antique furniture a rub-up, her busy, naughty little mind was reactivating all that had been seen, said, and thought about the night before, and preparing the speech she would make, not to Parliament, but to that maker of parliamentarians, Sir Wilmot Corrison. While he was not himself a member of the House, she knew he was something big and powerful in politics. To do her common sense and lively intelligence justice, Mrs. Harris's plans for that morning went no further than the sheer joy of having a captive audience pinned down in bed, unable to escape from the overflow she was about to get off her chest on what was wrong with the country. It simply was an opportunity too good to be missed. For while Mrs. Harris was an incorrigible chatterer and conversationalist, her clients were usually not, and she was not fool enough to fail to see through their subterfuges. "Dear Mrs. Harris, I should love to stay and talk to you, but I've sent for a taxi." "How very interesting, Mrs. Harris. I do wish I could hear the rest of your story, but I'm late for my dentist now." "Oh dear, Mrs. Harris, what a pity. Isn't that somebody at the door?"
"Next week, when I've more time, we must have a real long chat."
But there, upstairs, bound hand and foot, as it were, by ties of gratitude as well as indisposition, was someone who would not only have to listen to her, but might very well be expected even to understand what she was talking about. And thus Sir Wilmot, having enjoyed breakfast, mastered his craving for a cigarette, and just about to sink into a blissful doze, found the bill-collector appearing in the doorway of the bedroom in the shape of a little old lady with cheeks like shrunken winter apples, snapping, sparkling dark eyes, and a mischievous quirk to her mouth. A frail, wispy woman with greyish curls leaking out from underneath her dust cap, leaning not ungracefully upon her weapon, the dust broom. Mrs. Harris launched.
Did you watch the telly last night?
Eh? What's that? The which?
I mean that programme called What Do You Think?
What? Why, yes, as a matter of fact I did. There was nothing else to do. Damn silly, wasn't it?
I'd like to have your opinion on that what's-his-name. The one that kept hogging the talk. Him with the fish eyes and the false teeth.
Sir Wilmot was conscious of a mild feeling of amusement and the sense of incongruity. Lying in bed talking politics with his charwoman appealed to the innate snob in him.
You mean the Honourable Ronald Puckle, MP? He's an ass.
Then,
demanded Mrs. Harris,
what's he doing in our government?
Vote-getter,
replied Sir Wilmot.
He talks down to a lot of other asses who vote for him.
Coo,
said Mrs. Harris.
I never heard such a lot of eyewash in all my life. Add up everything he said he was going to do for the country, and in the end, what did you have? Nothing.
Sir Wilmot grinned at the shrewdness of Mrs. Harris's mathematics. Every plus offered by the honourable member from Marley Vale was immediately followed by a minus, leaving one with the sum total of 0.
That's how you keep your seat in Parliament.
Now, if it was me that was running the country, I'd know what to tell them, and no shilly-shallying.
It was more the sudden change of Mrs. Harris's stance on her broom handle than her words, which set up alarm bells ringing in Sir Wilmot. Fun was fun, but to be subjected to a long and boring tirade on the subject of what was wrong with the country, particularly when he was feeling under the weather and unable to escape, was something else again. There was never a dinner party or a social gathering he attended, but someone had him by the lapel, dinning into his ears their panaceas for Britain's modern-age dilemmas.
Yes, said Sir Wilmot hastily. I'm sure you would, but for the moment.
And feeling that actions would speak louder than words, he settled down a bit in the bed and closed his eyes. But it was too late, for Mrs. Harris was no longer even aware of him. The Joan of Arc that is latent in every woman had been loosed, and holding the handle of the broom away from her like the shaft of a banner, she launched forth.
I'll tell you what I'd say to them to make them sit up. Live and let live. They won't let us live. That's what's the matter. They never gives us a chance to get our heads above water before they're pushing us down again. Life was made to be lived, but they keep us worried from the first breath we draw to the last.
Sir Wilmot opened his eyes again, or rather they were opened for him by the combination of despair and clarion ring of the cry he had heard.
Live and let live!
And he was not at all astonished to see no longer the slightly ridiculous, garrulous figure of the typical London char on a soapbox, but a person of flaming and evident sincerity.
Who's the majority in the country? The respectable poor, that never has quite enough money to be able to relax and enjoy a bit of living. You know what's wrong with the system? It ain't labour, and it ain't capital. It's a squeezing of us in between, so that we can never catch up. We go to the shops, and one week to another, the prices is just that much higher than what we've got in our pockets. Give us a chance to enjoy life a little. That's all we ask.
Sir Wilmot felt strangely moved, and had the sophistication to ask himself why. Was it the physical weakness in himself engendered by the fever which he had managed to sweat out? Or was there some truth to the sudden illusion that he was listening to the voice of the millions of the faceless about whom nobody gave a damn? Not the poor and downtrodden, who had their spokesmen and their organisations to succour them, but the vast oceans of humanity in every land and every clime, as well as Britain, who, caught in the ever-rising spiral of wages and prices, never had quite enough to enable them to draw a free and joyous breath, and who were condemned to a slavery of worry far more destructive than abject poverty. There was something most arresting and rousing about that first anguished cry which still rang in his ears.
Live and let live. That's what I'd tackle,
Mrs. Harris was orating.
And do you know who I'd have a sharp word with? The working man. None of 'em has got the brains they was born with. And how do I know? Because I live amongst 'em and I've seen their women suffer. Strike, strike, strike. Them and their strikes. Hold out for months for a fourpenny rise, and take 3 years to catch up on what they lost on wages in the meantime. Not to mention killing the goose and sending the price of eggs up higher. If they've got to strike, it ought to be against prices. There's only one thing that'll help the working man, and it ain't strikes, it's work. And if he ain't got the brains to see that it's only work that makes money, he wants somebody with the brains to tell him so. Him and his 35-hour week. Where would you be if you only worked them hours? Or me? There wouldn't be enough for an extra cup of tea, or a cup of anything at all.
Like all shrewd and powerful men who have climbed up out of the ruck by the sheer force of their wits, Sir Wilmot's mind was able to operate on split levels. The bugle call of live and let live had set turning the wheels of political scheming. Schemes so offbeat and far-fetched that they were likely to be rejected immediately as impossible and absurd. Except that they were not entirely absurd because of the compelling figure into which the wispy little char had grown, holding the weapon of her trade almost like a flaming sword. That, and the memory of something he had either seen, heard, or read about in recent years, and not too long ago. He was only half listening to Mrs. Harris now, because of the smooth way the wheels had begun to mesh. And yet more of what she was saying was still coming through.
And as for the mods and rockers, you know what I'd do with them? I'd have their trousers down and give 'em a taste of the birch. That's what I'd do. Every mother's son of 'em, and their sluts too. I'd have their bottoms fanned. Bald, are they? I'd give 'em boredom at the end of a strap. And right out in a public square, that's what. That'd fix 'em, destroying property and beating up old men and women.
Another portion of Sir Wilmot's brain, where he kept his imagination, flashed a picture on his internal television screen of Sloane Square with a huge posy of bared bottoms at the centre and policemen beating on them with birch rods. No more mods and ruckers. It wouldn't work, naturally, but momentarily there was something curiously satisfying about the picture of this beastly form of social vengeance. What, after all, contained more common sense and practical value than spare the rod and spoil the child? Generation after generation that had not been spared the rod had grown up without so much as a sign of mod, rocker, or unwashed beatnik. The wheels continued to mesh smoothly and sweetly. It was, of course, utterly impossible, but that was not what the cogs were saying.
As for them ban the bombers, Mrs. Harris went on, you know what they are, don't you? Mostly a lot of rotten, filthy communists. Or fools, and I don't know which is worse. Filthy! Filthy dirty, some of them. I've seen them. Out from under a flat stone. I'd give 'em marching. Do you know where I'd march them? Right through a bath. That's where. That's what they need. Clean up their bodies, and maybe you clean up their minds.
Sir Wilmot's private television now produced another picture for him, a long, snake-like, unending line of greasy, unwashed, subversive failures, passing through something like a gigantic car wash and emerging from the other side clean, sparkling, and freed from their burden of wishing to make everyone and everything as foul and useless as themselves. Inwardly he smiled at himself for the ingenuousness, and then once again the beat of live and let live took over, and the wheels turned faster. Mrs. Harris was not so sound on foreign policy.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?